Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Safandari and I'm from PBI2. Today we will presented our material about internal validating. But first, let me introduce ourselves. My name is Safandari and my friends' names are Elsa Safitri and Elsa Windiasari. Internal validity. What is internal validity? Imagine this following experiment was interested in understanding what factors were important for a long lifespan. They thought that drinking water was important. So they decided to get a bunch of people together in a room and give them all a glass of water. The scientists told them one around in the room and they'd come back in 18 years to check it in on them. Sure enough, the research checked back in after 18 years and found the subject had all died. The basis of this research concluded water must be deadly. Of course, this conclusion is valid. This experiment, the independent variable, that is, the variable experiment, was trained to measure this lifespan length, and the independent variable that was changed by the experimenter was the drinking a glass of water. Uh, One thing that needed for conclusion to be valid is the independent variable has to be the only one that influence dependent variable in this lifespan experiment. There are of course many other factors beside the independent variable that influence the dependent variable, uh, the least of which lacking of people in the room without feeding them for 18 years. This is what internal validity is about. It's the extent to which you are able to say that to other variable apart from independent variable cause the result change in dependent variable factors, that the independent variable that may influence the outcome of the experiment are called confounding variables. So far the example uh, get lack of found is a confounding variable in this Lifetime study. Even a variable other than dependent variable can influence dependent variable in this Lifetime study. This study has a poor internal validity. The best way to ensure an experiment has a good internal validity is to make sure there is a control group that get treated the exact same was as the treatment group, just without getting the treatment. For example, in lifetime study, the influence of confounding variables could probably by inclusion of the control group that perhaps also locked in a room for 18 years uh, without food, but were give were given a glass of water to drink to start. They would probably hear after that some of, uh, offer the same fate as the group that drank the water, revealing to the experiment that something other than the drinking water, of course, the deed of the participant. Uh, every time you assess a research study, you should make sure there is a control group that receive every day. Make sure there's a control group that receive every time the experimental group gets just without the experimental intervention. This will help you to judge the experiment has a good enough internal validity or not. Okay, next. 1. Subject characteristic. The result in individual or group differ from one to another in united ways. For example, when English 20 and 11 often lose from the lectures in the pooling talk competition. Second, loss of subject. Loss of subject, loss of a participant. For example, firstly there is a 100 participant. A week later, there are only 88. Then where 22 students go? Maybe they got illness, dying, absent, or so on. Location. 3. Location. The particular place which the data are collected. For example, doing an interview with a student in the classroom and student long will different result. 4. Instruments. The way in which instrument is used, for example, checking a bunch of questionnaires. And firstly, the researcher is feeding up to do checking, and then later he gets tired and mostly checking. 5. Collector. Characteristic. Sometimes data collector is gathered an inevitable part of instrument. For example, a researcher wants to know how society opinion towards the police duties. In case the researchers dress up like a police, then tend to give a positive opinion. Therefore, they will give a positive opinion. 6. Collector bias. Collector prevents or judgment. For example, what do you think about Wi-Fi? Since collector is sensitive with Wi-Fi, sometimes he neglect the rubric and then the participant integrating the participant.
Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. My name is Elsa Safitri. I will continue the explanation. Okay. The next is a testing. The intervention study where data are collected over a period of a time is common to test subject at the beginning of the intervention. It's called a testing. Testing use of a pretest in intervention study may create a practice effect that can affect the result of the study and on how participants respond to an intervention. There are some examples of testing treats are as follows. The first is a researcher used exactly the name set of the problem to measure change over time in student ability to solve mathematical problems. And the second, a researcher incorporates item design to measure self-esteem and achievement motivation in the same questionnaire. Next is history. An occasion, one or more unanticipated and unplanned for, even may occur during the course of study that can affect the response of the subject. Such as an event is referred to in educational research as a history trait. A history trait is when an unforeseen or unplanned event occurs during the course of a study. There are two examples of history trait follow. The first is a researcher designed a study to investigate the effect of simulation games or ethnocentrism She plans to select two high schools to participate in experiment. Students in both schools will be given a pretest designed to measure their attitude towards minority groups. And the second, the achievement score of 5 elementary school was teacher used a cooperative learning approach are compared with those of 5 schools whose teachers do not use this approach. And the next is maturation. Often change during an intervention may be due to factors associated with the passing of time rather than to the intervention itself. This is known as a maturation rate. Maturation rate change during the intervention may be due sometimes on a factor associated with the passing of time rather than the intervention. There are some examples of a maturation rate are as follows. The first is a researcher report that students in liberal arts college become less accepting of authority between their freshman and senior years and attribute this to the many liberating experiences they have undergone in the college. And a researcher tests a group of the students enrolled in a special class for students with artistical potential, every year for 6 years. And she finds that their drawing ability improved markedly over the years. And the next is attitude of subject. The way subjects view a study and their participant in it can be considered a trait to internal validity. The positive impact of an intervention is known as the Hawthorne effect. Here, there are some examples of a subject attitude trait. The first, a researcher decided to investigate the possible reduction of a test anxiety by playing classical music during examination. She randomly selected a 10 freshman class from the 5 schools in a large urban school district. And the second, a researcher hypothesized that critical thinking skill is correlated with attention to detail. He administered a somewhat novel test that provides a separate score for each variable. It is critical thinking and attention to detail, to a sample of 8 grades. And the last is regression. Regression trait may be present whenever change is studied in a group that is extremely low or high in this pre-intervention performance. A regression trait is possible when change is studied in a group with extreme low or high performance as determined by a pretest. On average, that group will score closer to the mean of the subsequent testing regardless of the treatment or intervention. There are some examples of a possible regression trait are as follows. The first, an Olympic track coach select the member of her team from those who have a fastest time during the final trial for various events. And the second, the students who score in the lowest 20% on a math test are given special help. 6 months later, their average score on a test involving a similar problem has improved, but not necessary because of the special help. Okay, I think enough for my explanation. Next, presenter.
Okay, now I will explain about experimentation trait. Whenever an experimental group is treated in ways that are unintended and not a necessary part of the method being studied, an implementation trait can occur. The implementation trait can happen in either of two ways. The first one, an implementation trait can occur when different individuals are assigned to implement different methods, and these individuals differ in ways related to the outcomes. The example in which two groups of students are taught by either an inquiry or a lecture method.
The inquiry teachers may simply be better teachers than the lecture teachers. There are a number of ways to control for this possibility. The researchers can attempt to evaluate the individuals who implement each method on pertinent characteristics such as teaching ability, and then try to equate the threat group on these dimensions. For example, by assigning teacher of equivalent ability to each group. And another control is to require that each method be taught by all teachers in study and use several different individuals to implement each method, thereby reducing the chance of an advantage to either method. And then the second, an implementation trait can occur when some individuals have a personal bias in favor of one method over the other. One solution for this is to allow individuals to choose the method they wish to implement, but this creates the possibility of difference in characteristics discussed above. Okay, this is example of an implementation trait. Researchers is interested in studying the effect of a new diet on the physical agility of young children. After obtaining the permissions of the parents of the children to be involved, all of whom are first graders, he randomly assigned the children to an experimental group and a control group. The experimental group is tried to the new diet for 3 months, and the control group is to stay with its regular diet. The researchers overlooks the facts, however, that the teachers of the experimental group is an accomplished instructors of some 5 years experience, while the instructors of the control group is the first year teachers newly appointed. Okay, now we talk about controlling threats to internal validity. How can a researcher minimize this threat to internal validity? Researchers can try to do any or all of the following. The first one, standardizing the conditions under which the study occurs, such as the way in which the treatment is implemented, or in interventions studies, the way in which the data are collected, and so on. This helps control for locations, instrumentation, subject attitude, and implementation threats. And the second, obtaining and using more information on the subject of the study, that is, on relevant characteristic of the subject, and use that information in analyzing and interpreting results. This help control for a subject characteristic trait and possible mortality trait, as well as maturations and regression trait. And the third, obtaining and using more information on details of the study, that is, where and when it takes place, extraneous events that occur, and so on. This helps control for locations, instrumentations, history, subject attitude, and implementation trait. And the last, choosing an appropriate design. The proper design can do much to control this threat to internal validity. The proper design can do much to control these threats to internal validity. You can see this is a table about general techniques for controlling threats to internal validity. For subject characteristic trait, The tactics for controlling the threats are obtaining and using more information on subject of the study and choosing an appropriate design. And mortality, the general techniques for control the threats same as subject characteristics are obtaining and using more information on the subject of the study and choosing an appropriate design. And for location, the techniques for controlling the threats are standardized conditions, obtain more information on details, and choose an appropriate design, and so on. And then there are 2 points to emphasize. The first one, these various threats to internal validity can be greatly reduced by planning. And the second, such planning often requires collecting additional information before a study begins or while it is taking place. It is often too late to consider how to control these threats once the data have been collected. Okay, we think that's all for our explanation about internal validity. Thank you for your great attention. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.